Can we get you guys to sit down? You sit down, everybody else follows. Yeah, no. I have too much neurotic energy to sit. All right, so we get to tell you guys what happens the next 2.5 days. Yoo-hoo! The moment I wake up, before I put on my makeup, I say a little prayer for you. I don't know the words, moving on. Or I do, I'm going to mess them up. All right, so I hope coffee was good. I hope there were some cookies. We're going to move on. Before we move into the zones of experiments, we have 2 things that we want to share with you guys. There are people without a microphone who are louder than I am. I'm jealous. All right, so first, you got to hear what some of the other people are saying. We looked through the responses of your survey and we found some funnies. This is what you guys are saying. Bureaucratic status. Can we have a person who sort of wrote it? I'm trying to put you on a spot. You don't have to raise your hand. But if you do want to own up to the fact that you wrote, there you go. Thank you so much. Can you stand up, please? Kate Phillip, bureaucratic status. Well done. Can we get a hand of applause for this? Yeah. All right. Those were some small truths. Now let's move to the serious stuff. The agenda. What are we going to do for the next 2.5 days? As we mentioned, the heart of Istanbul Innovation Days as a mechanism for us to really hit the reset button on the operating system of UNDP and our partners is learning by doing, hearing from those who are hardcore, on the ground, doing practical stuff and exploring the edges of some of the tensions that we're seeing as a result of the failure of governance models. So today, for the rest of the day and tomorrow morning, we're going to have 6 zones of experiments. There will be 2 zones running in parallel all the way through lunch tomorrow, right? And this is the moment you have to make a decision. We've asked you which zones you will be participating in, and you've given your answers. It's completely okay to change your answer. Probably going to get nailed by the rest of the team for telling you this, but it's completely okay to change, to change your opinion. But you get a chance to see 3 out of 6 zones, okay? And then
tomorrow afternoon, we're going to reflect. After experimentation, to reflect. Now, first we have 2 panels tomorrow afternoon. The first panel, we call it the policy panel. It is the panel where we will discuss we look at experimentation-based policy making based on the 2 days of experimentation and the evidence-based policy making. We will look what is the tension between the 2. And we will discuss how we can further elevate. We see a lot of very innovative projects happening at a micro level. But we realize that very often we fail to elevate them to a more macro level and to make sure they inform policy making. So this will be the topic of the first panel in the afternoon tomorrow. And we will end the IID Day 2, the first part of IID, with a panel which is called The Future of Governance and Peacebuilding. There we will have several experts on different areas for governance and peacebuilding, and they will reflect on what does this all mean for the future of governance and peacebuilding. The experimentation we went through together today and tomorrow, what does this mean, and how can we then also, as UNDP, further design the next-gen Gov agenda. And then day 3 will be a day where will be dedicated to UNDP only, but it's a very important day. It is for us to think together how can we take this forward. The 4 questions we had in the beginning. What is UNDP's role in harnessing the opportunities of innovation and technologies, but also what is our role to mitigate the risks? That will be the objective of day 3.
Very good. The measure of success after this event is to what extent what you've heard and learned has really stretched the work that you're doing today onto a different plane, right? When you split into zones of experimentation, you're going to get your little sort of personal learning journey booklet. But that's going to be a moment in time for you to start noting in what ways your work is going to be stretched. The reason I bring that up, and you will hear this from a couple of people more and more, is that we will, on the spot, pick people with booklets, open them up, and see what you have in there. Take pictures and broadcast it to others. I come from the Balkans. We've had a really strict education system, so I'm kind of borrowing from this. Now, you are probably wondering, why do we have these specific 6 zones of experiment? Right? The way we arrived at this, we looked at big trends and big risks, which we've done, which organizations like OECD have done, WEF. But then we took a step forward and said, okay, we see the trends and we see the risks, but how do they actually manifest on the ground? Who is paying the cost of some of these risks, and how, and who is addressing them? So we started looking at many, many organizations and individuals who are in this room and who are going to be with us for 2 days about the work that they do. And we saw that some of the work is congregating around cities, for example. Some of the work is congregating around managing the commons. This is all to say we picked 6 that at that point in time we found have the most energy in them. You might be thinking there are other areas of work that are coming out and mushrooming. We want to be able to capture all of that. But before going there, I would like to give the space to Indy, who's our partner in organizing IID, to tell you a little bit more as to how we got to these 6 zones of experimentation. Gandalf.
Thank you. Good morning, all. Delighted to be here. We're gonna set the frame for the next few days. So as Millie said, the real objective of the next few days is to get to some experiments, some ideas for experiments that you want to try around the world. That's the objective, and we're going to be running towards them. You've got extraordinary, and I genuinely mean extraordinary people here who are doing extraordinary experiments and trialing new ways of looking at the issue of governance. But I want to set a little bit of the scene.
That's not me.
I always look at you. Right. If we want to talk about this, I want to set a little bit of the conversation here. When we talk about governance, what are we really talking about? It's no longer just a technicality of policy making. It's actually a structural issue. Whether you look at any of the issues around inequality that we're starting to see, or whether you look at actually even the distribution of globalization benefits and how they're manifesting. So look at the big issue of governance. That's where we want to go here. That's why when Millie turned around and said governance at the heart of the issue, it was about saying governance is the heart of actually the SDGs. Because actually the hypothesis we want to put forward, actually of the last 20 years, we've perhaps seen the systemic failure of governance. Now, one hypothesis you can put forward is, well, actually this hypothesis is that, you know, perhaps governments have not been able to keep up with technology. Another thing is, there's a whole rhetoric of burn the red tape. We should partner more with private sector. Or perhaps, actually, we haven't enabled governments to be technologically empowered to be able to deal with this stuff. So let's start to really think about this conversation in harder ways. But let's keep it also in frame. This is the world we're talking about. So when we talk about governance, I'm not just talking about this in a nice, hey, let's have a bit of fun sort of way. I'm talking about a world which is literally burning on our watch. The IPCC report said we have 12 years to deal with this issue, right? 12 years. I often do this test in the middle of this. How many of you think by 2030 we'll have delivered the SDGs? Put your hands up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
All the rest are fired.
Right. But this is the point, right? Increasingly, SDGs is not even a goal, it's a necessity. It actually is, look at that. That's pretty much every state that is now nearly 2 degrees temperature anomaly around the world. People are looking at 5 degrees temperature anomalies if we go actually at the current rate, at least. That is a completely different world. And I'm just using that as an example. We've already seen the impacts of inequality globally in what it's done in the rise of nationalism. Gini coefficient at 0.8 perfectly reflects actually the breakdown of societal infrastructures. So what happens when we start to think about this? What happens with this? Currently, 4%, right? All of the world's mammals, 4% are wild. Just 4. Not 40, not 14, 4%. We have 56 billion cattle living in the world. 70% of the world's birds are poultry. Only 30% are wild. So all the nice little things that we see flying out there, 30%. So when we start to look at the scale of the challenges we face, actually there's a real issue to get onto the table. Let's manifest that. That's what this means. See that big yellow thing? That's cow pastures. Urban land use, governance, how we eat, what we eat, the impacts that we have. These are all structural issues that are likely in the next 10 years to have to be radically resolved and reimagined. And where is some of this value being captured? Increasingly in land. So when we talk about all these conversations of tech companies, actually what we're seeing is value is increasingly being captured not by tech companies. Yes, they become a few $1 billion. It's land where value is being captured, disproportionately, and also by the landowners. So in a world which is becoming increasingly intangible, land is becoming increasingly valuable as a proxy of capturing that value. So we have fundamental failure between the value creation and where the value is being captured. That is a structural governance issue. And there's fun things. How do you govern this? A silent rave. Is it a noise pollution issue? Right? Or a fake restaurant? I mean literally fake. Made out of that food. How do you deal with global silencing? Censorship, self-censorship. How do you deal with any of this stuff? How do you deal with a world where, this is a real, so Google are building Sidewalk Lab in Toronto. And in that, they're looking for 211 regulatory innovations. 211. There is 2 people on the city of Toronto to deal with that. There is no capacity on the state side, either capacity, capability to deal with this stuff. Often, we sit with governments and they sort of say, we want Uber, give us all the data. And Uber say, sure, what are you going to do with trillion bytes of data? There's no capacity on the other side. Either to analyze it or to comprehend how to even govern the biases in privatized markets. Privatized digital markets which are real-time adjusted by algorithms. Where is the capacity to deal with that future on the government side? And as those markets become more and more complex, actually, slowly what we're seeing is the birth of RegTech infrastructures, privatized infrastructures for governing and interpreting analog regulations. So we're seeing government becoming less and less capable of dealing with the complexities and the invisible biases that these platforms hold. This is no longer a choice, it's a necessity. And as someone said, I mean, brilliant person, an old colleague of mine from Demos said, actually, the reason we need to govern technological companies is that if we don't, people will burn technology down. This is no longer a choice, it's the only way to move forward. And then look at this. eBay deals with 40 times the micro disputes of the UK every day. eBay. So tech companies are innovating ways to deal with dispute management, conflicts in radically different ways. How do we start to innovate and drive their stuff in different formats? And then we need to recognize we are operating in a slightly different world. A human-to-human world can be governed separately from actually an analog machine, sort of corporate rule-based world. But actually what happens when we become machine rule-based? What happens when this become machine learning rule-based systems? And what happens when 40% of our economy is entirely machine to machine? This is not tomorrow. This is not the UK. This is Vietnam. This is India. This is every economy around the world is having to gear up to thinking differently. And the rules aren't set. There is no leader in this. We might have the tech ambassador of Denmark sitting there, but I'm having the same conversations in Vietnam. This future is no longer divided between the developed and developing economies. In fact, it's a brand new territory, which is going to be reimagined in radical new ways. So when we start to think about this, we have to get more fundamental. When we talk about governance, we're not just talking about pure, simple regulation. We're talking about market design, market shaping. How do we build the capacity to shape privatized, digitalized markets? How do we re-understand monopolies? Or when organizations like Facebook are natural monopolies, how do we understand and regulate them? They're not free market corporates. They work by their monopolistic power. They're a network effect economy. Norms, cultural norms, technical infrastructures, rule of law in this age. And finally, and perhaps most fundamentally, legitimacy. We've seen legitimacy decline for trusted institutions pretty much globally in all 4 sectors. How are we going to deal with that? Without that, much of the technological innovation is not even feasible, not even possible. So how do we create the space for governance innovation without legitimacy is a foundational question. And we have some brilliant people here who are going to talk about citizen assemblies, who are talking about different ways of organizing public discourse to build the levels of trust to make progressive decisions. So it's not a technological conversation, but it requires different sorts of frameworks from hosting this conversation. If we go forward, we also have to recognize actually paradigms of governance. Historic models of governance were loosely coupled. Compliance and regulation didn't happen instantaneously, right? If you fail something, you didn't instantly through census get a bill through the door or a court summons. They were loosely coupled. Technology, actually one of the interesting things it's doing is tightly coupling that. Technology can stop your car moving if you go more than 30 miles per hour. That is quite feasible, plausible reality. Is that the world we want? Or do we want the 3rd generation of technologies, 3rd generation of governance to be about ennobling people? Making people more noble to self-correct and adjust? Is governance always about control? Or is this a paradigm outdated? Or is a governance an invitation to be more noble? I want to put that on the table. We must not see governance as just a theory of control. We must see governance as a theory of ennobling, to invite people to be more human and more considerate about their positions. So we know the judges in America, when they were given AI-supported decisions, if you told people what to do, they reacted badly. If you told them what spectrum their decision was on, they reacted much more favorably. Because you said, your decision sits on this part of the spectrum. You help them be better. So what is the role of technology? How do we use governance in driving that is fundamentally open to question. And there's lots of different examples around that. Now, I'm not going to focus on technology, but technology enables a different conversation, right? So if you look back at Uber, I'm going to use it as an example. Uber destroyed the cab office. It destroyed administration. It didn't destroy the taxi driver. It destroyed the administrative part of cab offices. The paradigm of technology and governance is it changes how we organize. Not necessarily the principles or the values, but what we organize. What happens in a world where actually you can do geofence regulations? Even smart policy. You're going to hear some people here, amazing people here, who are going to talk to you about writing smart policies, literally code law. What are the implications of doing that? What are the legibility issues about doing that? What does a white paper look like for government when the law is written in code? These processes are going to be rebuilt in the next 3 to 5 years. I need all of us to start to imagine what these processes need to look like to ensure we deliver an inclusive future for everyone that lives with us. It is really important that UNDP and all our partners start to think about this future and actually consciously design it, not be the victims of this reality created by third parties. So the reason why this is important, and I think Millie laid this out pretty early on, is what I want to put forward to you is this. The current practices that we've all been running have been effective and useful. But As we've seen with technology, we've seen technology and the implications of technology, whether it's CRISPR, as was being said by Millie, and the CRISPR baby, all the way through. We're seeing systemic risk rise, all the ones I pointed out earlier. Current practice. If we are here, the gap is not just here. The gap is between here and what the near future looks like. Because the near future is moving very quickly. How do we prepare for that conversation? It is no longer enough to say, well, Facebook will self-govern itself. It is no longer enough to imagine Uber as a privatized market will ever work just through actually letting go. There is a real desire and necessity to start to imagine how we govern and create the infrastructure, the regulatory infrastructure for these futures. So how do we build and bridge this relevance gap? And this relevance gap is fundamental, and it's not just in one part of the world. It is increasingly a global conversation, and a global conversation on that basis. So, in terms of doing some of these challenges, we know there's brilliant things that are already out there. Yen Ang's book, who's read it? One. Okay, two.
Nerds.
Three. Yen Ang's book is, I think, everyone here who's a governance professional should read it.
Yep.
It's a paradigm change on how we talk about governance. The theory on governance, in terms of actually thinking about governance, has been largely import strong, secure governance in play, and everything else works. We need the strong governance, and then everything will work. In fact, you could argue strong governance is only good for FDI. If you want indigenous growth, actually what you need is agile governance, which responds to the reality of the context and allows for enough variation to actually emergent truths to emerge. So Yen Ang talked about how China escaped the poverty trap by purposefully thinking about gray policy to allow for decentralized innovation across China. Now, in that process, they also have, you can't do this, you must do this. Same time, as new innovations happened, they would actually say, with enough transparency and data and oversight, they would say, we're going to ban this, we're going to accept that. So they were continuously able to adjust real time to actually the governance issues and failures that are emerging. This is not about strong governance or regulation, it's about agile governance, which is highly responsive to data and information. What does that world look like? We need to be able to do that not just in China, but globally with new models. And they are already on the table. So, I'm sorry for some of you, but this is I'm going to use a London example, not for any other reason, because actually it's one of the few teams that's built this capacity. Transport for London is one of the largest actually governance teams, data-driven governance teams out there. 25 people actually doing transport governance in a radically new, different way. And what they've been doing is literally this. They're allowing companies to do experiments on the basis of a code of conduct with radical data oversight. You have to share your data. And as they look at the public benefit of those experiments, they roll them out. As a model of how we regulate in a complex emergent world, I think it's part of a paradigm. And it builds exactly on Yen Ang's thesis that actually we need agile, data-driven, responsive capability in governance, not just the illusion of strength. At the same time, we've had other infrastructures. We've had a whole suite of regulatory sandboxes built now all over the world. Whether it's actually in India or Japan or Singapore, Malaysia, literally everywhere around the world, people are exploring regulatory sandboxes, locations with high levels of oversight to explore technologies which are at the other paradigm. Currently, those regulatory sandboxes are largely about saying, okay, we let you do this. We'll give you a pass. We'll give you clarifications. The next generation of regulatory sandboxes will almost certainly have the capacity to test real smart regulation in association with those new technologies. Agile formation of code regulation as those technologies are being developed and real-time evolving them. That is not tomorrow, that is today. Traceability. We've seen extraordinary work, whether it's provenance, looking at security of those backbones in different formats. Again, you'll see many of the experiments on the table looking at some of those issues. So how do we drive integrity and traceability across complex systems, transparency across complex systems? Again, that's more possible than it's ever been. And you can go all the way down to real-time licensing, all the way down to simple thing of how you street license a piece of food being sold at the street. That is going to be changed when you can do that at the point of sale on a phone. When you can do that at point of sale and your taxation model becomes real time. Uber is not just the beginning of a different conversation about how you move cars, it's also moving us to real-time taxation thesis. So all these things are fundamental and open at this moment in time, and we can go on. So what does that do for geolocation, auto-compliance sensors, digital confirmation, smart receipts, provenance? This thesis is not just a London thesis, I guarantee you. We're having these conversations all over the world. But they have fundamental questions at the center of them. Who does this? How is this world brought forward? And they have hard thesis, right? So if you look at ownership or property rights, we still have a world with massive amounts of informal property rights. What does title deed insurance do on any of this infrastructure to allow for the formalization of property rights? What does it do when you can actually split use rights? Property rights are bundled rights between use, development, future development rights. What happens when you can efficiently unbundle them? What happens when it allows for use to be separated fundamental from the future right of development or resource rights? Technology is fundamentally changing the frame of how those rights can be structured, traded, sold, taxed, acknowledged, used. All those things are possible. So again, this conversation is not about technology, but understanding the implications that it provides. And then also the counter implications. So when you have an opinion-formed system, which Facebook is driving, opinion mechanisms, how do you drive progressive policy? Well, what citizen assemblies have been finding out is that you have to have the spaces for deliberative discourse in a radically different way. So, over the next course of a few days, you are going to hear some extraordinary experiments, right? The objective, let's listen. Let's figure out what the principles are. Let's figure out what the challenges are. Let's figure out actually how we think about this. Let's figure out how we build capacity. Because I think the fundamental thesis we have to win, this is not about burning the red tape. It is not about saying economic growth requires regulation and governance to be burnt. No, economic growth requires governance to be reimagined to allow for equitable growth for everyone. It's a thesis of ennobling and releasing the full capacity to everyone. That is the role for governance. It doesn't have to be a counter. So the political discourse that we've locked ourselves in is burn governance and we'll get economic growth. That isn't where we're headed. Right now, we're about to burn ourselves. So it is the role of the next few days to start to not only build a conversation and an issue, and really understand 30 experiments. We want, at the end of these 2 days, to have 30 experiments that you want to prototype. There are brilliant designers in the room who will sit there and help you draw them up. Ideas, initial thoughts, but let's get them on the table. Right, with that, I've done my sort of little bit of framing. I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Joost, who is going to launch into this, the experiments and give us a little bit of frame where we're headed and zones of experiments. Thanks, Joost.
Can we give India? Yeah.
Thank you.